I never liked camping alone. There was always something unsettling about being out in the wilderness with nothing but a thin layer of nylon separating me from the vast, dark unknown. But that weekend, I needed the escape. Work had been relentless, and I craved silence. I packed up my gear and drove out to a remote campsite deep in the woods, far from the usual crowded spots. The drive itself was peaceful. The winding roads cut through dense forest, and the further I got from town, the quieter everything became. I had chosen a spot near a small, unnamed lake, one I had found through an old hiking forum. It was far from any major trails, which meant I'd likely have the place to myself. That was the goal. I arrived in the late afternoon. The sun hung low, casting long shadows through the trees. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, the kind of scent that made me feel like I had truly left the world behind. I parked my truck on a narrow dirt path and hiked the rest of the way in, about a mile from where the road ended. The campsite was perfect. A small clearing surrounded by towering trees, with just enough space for my tent and a fire pit. The lake sat still and dark, its surface barely rippling with the occasional breeze. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and sat by the shore for a while, letting the quiet sink in. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I started a fire. The flames crackled, sending flickering light against the trees. I cooked a simple meal, some canned chili and a few strips of bacon. The warmth of the fire mixed with the cool night air, making me feel at ease. That changed when I heard the first sound. It was faint, just a rustling in the brush. Probably an animal, I told myself. Maybe a raccoon or a fox sniffing around. But as I listened, the rustling didn't move like an animal. It was slow, deliberate. The hairs on my arms stood up. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the trees, but all I saw were shadows. I tried to shake it off, but my senses stayed on high alert. The fire burned lower, and the sounds of the forest became more noticeable. An owl hooted in the distance. Crickets chirped. The rustling stopped. I convinced myself I was being paranoid. I had camped before and knew how easy it was for the mind to play tricks in the dark. I put more wood on the fire and settled in. A few hours passed, and the sounds of the night became white noise. I sat by the fire, watching the flames dance, feeling the warmth on my face. Sleep started to tug at me, so I decided to call it a night. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up tight, and lay down in my sleeping bag. The ground was hard, the air chilly, but exhaustion won. My eyes grew heavy. Then, a sound outside. Not rustling. Footsteps. Slow. Heavy. Deliberate. My breath caught in my throat. I strained to listen, my pulse hammering in my ears. The steps stopped just outside my tent. I could hear breathing. Not an animal, human. I didn't move. I barely breathed. A shadow passed over the thin fabric of my tent. Someone was standing there. I reached slowly for my knife, my fingers gripping the handle so tight my knuckles ached. My truck was too far. If I ran, I wouldn't make it. Then, just as suddenly as it came, the shadow moved away. The footsteps receded into the trees. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours. Morning couldn't come fast enough. As soon as the first light broke through the trees, I unzipped my tent and stepped out, my heart still hammering. The fire had burned down to embers. The air was still almost too quiet. Then I saw them. Footprints. Large, deep prints in the dirt around my tent. They circled it once, then disappeared into the trees. I packed up my gear in record time, shoving everything into my backpack without caring about order. I didn't eat. I didn't sit. I just wanted to leave. The hike back to my truck felt longer than before. Every snapped twig, every movement in the trees made my skin crawl. When I finally saw my truck, I exhaled sharply and practically ran to it. I threw my gear in the back, started the engine, and peeled out onto the dirt road. I didn't look back. I still don't know who was out there that night. A hunter? A drifter? Someone watching, waiting? I'll never know. But I haven't camped alone since, and I never will again. The dirt road stretched ahead of me, narrow and winding, cutting through dense woods that grew darker as the sun began its slow descent behind the trees. The campsite was about a half-mile ahead, past a shallow creek and tucked into the farthest corner of the state park. I had picked the spot deliberately, secluded, quiet, away from the usual weekend crowd. It wasn't my first solo camping trip. I had done this a dozen times before, relishing the escape from work and the endless distractions of life. There was something about being alone in the woods that made me feel grounded. Just me, a tent, a fire, and the sounds of the wild. But as I parked my truck and stepped out, a strange unease settled into my gut, heavy and slow, like a cold stone dropping into a pond. I shook it off. Unloading the truck took about 15 minutes. I had packed light, a small tent, sleeping bag, a cooler with food and water, and a few essentials. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and pine, and as I worked, I could hear the distant call of a woodpecker hammering against a tree. The sounds of the forest were familiar, comforting. I had no reason to feel uneasy. By the time my tent was set up and my fire pit was arranged, the sky had shifted to a dusky purple. I gathered firewood from the surrounding area, breaking off dry branches and stacking them neatly. The sound of cracking twigs under my boots echoed through the trees, and every so often, I caught myself glancing over my shoulder. There was nothing there, just the dense forest, silent and still. I shook the feeling again. It was normal being alone in the woods. Your mind played tricks on you. It made you hyper-aware of every sound, every shadow. But nothing was out of the ordinary. I built my fire, lit it, and watched as the flames grew, flickering in the growing darkness. The warmth helped settle my nerves, and I focused on cooking my dinner, a simple meal of grilled chicken and some canned beans. The night crept in fast, swallowing the last of the daylight. The stars above were bright, scattered across the sky in an endless sea. I ate in silence, listening to the rhythmic chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves in the distance. A breeze moved through the trees, cooling the air. I sat by the fire for a while after eating, letting the heat soak into my skin. The feeling of unease hadn't completely left, but it was quieter now, dulled by the warmth and the familiar ritual of camping. When I finally crawled into my tent and zipped myself inside, the exhaustion from the day settled over me like a blanket. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. The fire outside had burned down to embers, casting a dull, orange glow across the clearing. At first, I didn't know why I was awake. The air was still, the night was silent. And then I heard it, a single footstep, close. I held my breath, listening. The sound had been unmistakable, a heavy foot pressing into the earth, snapping a twig beneath it. My heart pounded in my chest. I lay still, barely breathing. Maybe it was an animal, I told myself. A deer, a raccoon. But my gut told me otherwise. And then I heard another step. Closer. The fire outside was too low to cast enough light beyond the immediate area, and my tent was zipped shut. I was blind, vulnerable. My mind raced through possibilities. A bear? No, a bear wouldn't be so cautious, so deliberate. I reached for my flashlight, gripping it tightly. My other hand found the handle of the knife I always kept with me on trips like this. I waited. Another step. Whoever or whatever it was, they were right outside my tent now. The fabric shifted slightly, as if someone had just barely brushed against it. My body went rigid. Every instinct screamed at me to stay silent, to not move. But the silence stretched on, suffocating. My pulse pounded in my ears. And then, as suddenly as it had come, the presence outside my tent was gone. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening, waiting. The forest remained silent.
No footsteps, no rustling.
Nothing. Eventually, exhaustion won. I don't remember falling asleep, only that I woke up to the early morning light filtering through the tent. My fire was nothing but cold ashes, and everything looked exactly as I had left it the night before, except for the footprints. They were clear, imprinted in the soft dirt around my tent. Deep, unmistakably human. Someone had been there, standing just outside while I slept. My stomach twisted. I packed up my gear as quickly as possible, shoving everything into the truck without my usual careful organization. I didn't eat. I didn't stop to take in the fresh morning air. I just left. The drive home was quiet, the unease settling deeper in my bones with every mile I put between me and that campsite. I don't camp alone anymore. I had never been a big fan of camping, but my brother, Jake, loved it. He had been talking about taking a trip for months, and I finally caved. He had picked a remote spot near a lake, miles away from any real civilization. He said it would be peaceful. I figured it would be a decent break from everything. No work emails, no city noise, just fresh air and quiet. The drive took nearly 4 hours, most of it on winding, unpaved roads. I was already exhausted by the time we arrived, but Jake was thrilled. The lake was beautiful, surrounded by thick trees that blocked out most of the sky. There was no one else around, just us. It was the kind of place that looked untouched, like no one had been there in years. We set up camp near the water, a little clearing with just enough space for our tent and a fire pit. Jake did most of the work while I gathered firewood. I kept noticing how quiet it was. No distant sounds of cars, no airplanes overhead, not even birds chirping. It was just us and the wind through the trees. Felt too quiet. That night, as we sat by the fire, I started to feel uneasy. The silence was weighing on me, making me feel like something was off. Jake didn't notice. He was too busy cooking hot dogs over the fire and talking about how much he wanted to do this every year. I tried to shake the feeling, but it stayed with me even as I crawled into my sleeping bag. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of something moving outside the tent. It wasn't the wind. It was slow, deliberate. Footsteps. I held my breath and listened. Jake was snoring softly beside me, completely unaware. I reached for the flashlight, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to make a sound. The footsteps stopped just outside the tent. I could hear breathing, deep, heavy breathing. My heart was pounding so hard I thought whoever, or whatever, was out there would hear it. I waited, every second feeling like an hour. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the breathing stopped and the footsteps moved away. I stayed awake the rest of the night, barely breathing, waiting for it to come back. But it didn't. In the morning, I told Jake what I had heard. He laughed it off, saying it was probably an animal. But I knew what I had heard. Animals don't breathe like that. Animals don't stop just outside your tent and listen. I walked around the campsite, looking for tracks. The dirt was dry and packed, but near the water I found them. Footprints. Human footprints. Barefoot, deep impressions in the wet sand. Someone had been standing there watching our tent. I showed Jake, and his smile faded. He stared at the footprints for a long time before shaking his head. Probably some hiker passing through, he said, but he didn't sound convinced. Neither was I. We decided to stay one more night. Maybe we should have packed up right then and there, but neither of us wanted to admit we were scared. We spent the day fishing and swimming, trying to shake off the feeling that we weren't alone. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little noise made me jump. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. Footsteps. This time, they were slower, more deliberate. I reached for the flashlight but stopped myself. I didn't want whoever was out there to know I was awake. Then the zipper on the tent moved. It was slow, careful, like someone was trying to be quiet. My heart nearly stopped. I grabbed Jake's arm and squeezed, trying to wake him up without making a sound. The zipper moved again, just a few inches. I saw the faintest sliver of darkness through the tiny gap. Jake woke up and sat up fast, making the tent shift. The zipper stopped moving. Everything was silent. Then, heavy footsteps ran away into the trees. Jake grabbed the flashlight and unzipped the tent in one quick motion, shining the beam into the darkness. Nothing. The trees swallowed the light. There was no one there. We sat up the rest of the night, backs to the tent, watching, listening. Every little sound made my skin crawl. At first light, we packed up as fast as we could. Neither of us said a word as we threw everything into the truck. When we finally drove away, I felt like I could breathe again. But as we turned onto the dirt road leading back to the highway, I looked back one last time. And there, standing just at the tree line, was a man, barefoot, watching us leave. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. Jake had seen him too. We never went camping again. I was never the type to get nervous about the woods. I grew up camping, hiking, fishing, all of it. I knew how to handle myself, knew what sounds to ignore, what to take seriously, how to keep calm when things felt off. But this trip was different. It was late October, and I had taken a few days off work to clear my head. Things had been stressful, long hours, little sleep, and a creeping feeling like I just needed to get away from people for a while. I packed up my truck, grabbed my gear, and drove out to a national forest a few hours from home. It wasn't a place I had been to before, but I had read about it online. Secluded, deep in the woods with trails that barely saw foot traffic. Exactly what I needed. The drive-in was quiet. A long, winding dirt road through thick trees, leaves already starting to turn, bright oranges and reds against the gray sky. No other cars, no signs of people. Just the occasional deer darting through the brush and the sound of my tires crunching over gravel. I found a decent clearing just off a narrow trail. It was far enough from the main road that I wouldn't hear any cars. Not that there were any to hear, but close enough that I could hike back if I needed to. The spot was perfect. A small stream nearby, plenty of space for my tent, and thick trees to block the wind. I set up camp quickly. Tent staked down, firewood gathered, food packed in a bear canister. By late afternoon, I was sitting by the fire, listening to the sounds of the woods. Birds, wind through the trees, the distant trickle of the stream. Peaceful. Then I noticed it, the quiet. It wasn't like the normal lulls in nature, where everything pauses for a few seconds. This was different. No wind, no rustling leaves.
No birds.
Just dead silence. I sat up, listening. My first thought was that a predator was nearby, maybe a bear, maybe a cougar, but I didn't hear anything. No snapping twigs, no movement, just nothing. I shook it off, telling myself I was just overthinking. The silence lasted maybe a minute before everything went back to normal. Wind picked up, birds chirped, the tension faded. But it happened again that night. I had been sitting by the fire, staring at the flames, when it hit me again. That same unnatural silence. The woods just stopped. No sound, no wind, no movement. Like the whole forest was holding its breath. I felt it then, that instinct, deep in my gut, that something wasn't right. I turned, scanning the trees with my flashlight. Nothing. Just the same dense forest, shadows stretching long in the firelight. I told myself it was fine, maybe just my imagination. I went to bed shortly after, crawling into my sleeping bag and zipping the tent shut. I left the fire smoldering outside, enough to keep animals away. Sleep didn't come easy. I kept waking up, feeling like something was off. Every time I listened, but there was nothing. Just the wind, the trees, the normal sounds of the forest. Then around 3 a.m. I heard it. Footsteps, not an animal. Not the quick, light steps of a deer or the shuffle of a raccoon. These were slow, heavy, measured, like someone was walking just outside my tent. I froze, barely breathing. The steps stopped. I waited. A minute passed. 2. Nothing. Just silence. I reached for my knife, gripping it tight. My mind raced. Was it a hiker? A hunter? Someone lost? Or was it something worse? I wanted to call out, ask who was there, but something in me screamed not to. Then, after what felt like forever, I heard the footsteps again, moving away this time, slow, deliberate, fading into the distance. I didn't sleep after that, just lay there, listening, knife in hand, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, the sky started to lighten. The second I had enough daylight, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, scanning the area. There were no footprints. The ground was covered in leaves, damp from the night air. If someone had walked through, there should have been something, a disturbance, a trail. But there was nothing. I packed up fast, threw everything into my truck, and got the hell out of there. I don't know what I heard that night. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe it was some kind of animal moving in a way I didn't recognize. Or maybe, just maybe, someone had been out there watching. All I know is that I won't be going back. I always loved camping. It was something my dad and I did a lot when I was younger. We would load up the truck, head out to some remote spot, and spend the weekend fishing, hiking, and just enjoying the quiet. As I got older, I started going on solo trips. There was something peaceful about being alone in the woods, away from everything. That's why, when I found a small, unnamed campground marked on an old map, I didn't hesitate to check it out. It was deep in the mountains, about a 3-hour drive from the nearest town. The dirt road leading there was barely visible, overgrown with weeds and littered with potholes. My truck struggled over the rough terrain, the tires kicking up dust as I navigated through the thick forest. When I finally reached the site, it was just as I had hoped. Isolated, quiet, and surrounded by nothing but trees and the distant sound of a small river. There were no designated camping spots, no signs, no other people. Just a clearing with a fire pit and some old logs arranged in a rough circle. I set up my tent near the treeline, close enough to the river that I could hear the water but far enough away to avoid any unexpected flooding. The sun was beginning to set as I got a fire going, the flames casting long shadows across the clearing. The air was cool, crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. It was perfect. After cooking a quick meal over the fire, I settled into my chair, listening to the crackling wood and the distant chirping of crickets. The isolation was comforting, a welcome break from the constant noise of everyday life. I stayed up for a while, watching the stars before finally crawling into my tent and zipping up the flap. I don't know what woke me up. Maybe it was the sudden silence. Maybe it was the feeling like something was watching me. I lay still, listening. The usual night sounds were gone.
No crickets.
No rustling leaves. Just an eerie, heavy silence pressing down on me. Then I heard it. A soft, deliberate crunch of leaves. Slow, heavy, close. I held my breath, my heart hammering against my ribs. It wasn't an animal. I had spent enough time in the woods to know the difference between a deer moving through the brush and someone, walking with purpose. Another step, closer. I reached for my flashlight, gripping it so tightly my fingers ached. My other hand hovered over my knife, just in case. Slowly, I unzipped the tent an inch, just enough to peek outside. Nothing. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting faint red light across the clearing. The trees stood still, unmoving in the cold night air, but the feeling was still there, that undeniable, skin-crawling feeling of being watched. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, listening, waiting, but there were no more footsteps, no movement, just that suffocating silence. Eventually, exhaustion won. I don't even remember falling asleep. I woke up to the sound of birds. The usual morning chorus filled the air, the unease from the night before feeling like a bad dream. Still, I couldn't shake it. Something had been there. I stepped out of my tent, stretching the stiffness from my limbs. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Not mine. Larger. Barefoot. Leading from the treeline to just a few feet away from my tent before turning back. A shiver ran down my spine. I scanned the tree line, my gut twisting. The footprints were fresh, pressed deep into the dirt. Someone had been standing outside my tent, watching me. I packed up quickly, my hands shaking as I shoved everything into my backpack. I didn't care about breakfast. I just wanted to get out. The drive back was tense. Every shadow between the trees felt like it was hiding something. Every bump in the road made my stomach tighten. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the road behind me. By the time I reached the highway, my pulse had finally started to slow. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, lingered long after I was safe in my truck. I never went back. I don't know who or what was out there that night, and I don't want to find out. I never liked camping. Something about being alone in the woods, cut off from the rest of the world, always made me uneasy. Maybe it was just the quiet or the way the darkness swallowed everything whole once the sun went down. But when my old friend Mike invited me on a weekend trip to a remote campsite, I said yes. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to prove something to myself. Maybe I didn't want to seem like a coward. The drive took longer than expected. The road twisted through the forest, narrow and barely maintained. By the time we reached the trailhead, the sun was starting to sink behind the trees. We had planned to arrive early enough to set up camp in the daylight, but now we had to hurry. The hike to the site was about 2 miles, mostly uphill, and the trail wasn't well marked. The deeper we went into the woods, the quieter it became. The usual forest sounds, birds, rustling leaves, distant animal calls, started to fade. It felt unnatural, like the forest was holding its breath. I didn't say anything, but I could tell Mike felt it too. He kept checking over his shoulder, his pace quickening. We didn't stop to rest. By the time we reached the clearing where we planned to set up camp, the sky had turned dark purple. We worked fast, setting up the tent and gathering firewood before we lost all light. Once the fire was going, some of the tension faded. The flickering glow pushed back the darkness, and for a little while it felt normal. We cooked, ate, and sat around the fire, talking about nothing important. But the uneasiness never really left me. I kept glancing at the tree line, expecting to see something watching us. Nothing was there. Around midnight, we decided to turn in. The fire was dying, and the cold was creeping in. I climbed into my sleeping bag and shut my eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. The fabric of the tent felt too thin, too fragile. Every noise outside made me flinch. Twigs snapping, leaves crunching. Then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate. My breath caught in my throat. The sound was close, maybe 20 feet from the tent. I wanted to believe it was an animal, but it was too steady, too heavy. I held my breath, waiting. The footsteps stopped. Silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. Then something brushed against the tent. A light tap, then another. I wanted to wake Mike, but I couldn't move. My body refused to cooperate. I just lay there listening. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The forest was silent again. I stayed awake for hours, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. The next morning, we didn't talk about it. Maybe Mike hadn't heard anything. Maybe he had, but didn't want to acknowledge it. Either way, we went about our day as planned. We hiked, fished, tried to enjoy the trip. But the whole time, I felt like we were being watched. That night, it happened again. The same slow footsteps, the same quiet tap against the tent. But this time, I heard breathing. Shallow, ragged, close. I forced myself to sit up, heart pounding so hard it hurt. I didn't dare move the tent flap. I just sat there listening. Then, suddenly, the breathing stopped and the footsteps retreated into the woods. The next morning, we found footprints in the dirt around our tent. Bare feet, human. Mike wanted to pack up and leave. I didn't argue. We moved fast, shoving everything into our packs. The whole time, I felt exposed, like we were being watched from the trees. We were halfway down the trail when we heard it. A voice, low, hoarse, calling out from somewhere in the woods. Help me. It didn't sound right. It didn't sound desperate. It sounded practiced, like someone repeating the words without understanding them. We didn't stop. We didn't look. We just kept moving. By the time we reached the car, we were shaking. We threw our gear in the trunk and sped off, not saying a word until we were miles away. I don't know who or what was out there. I don't want to know, but I know I'll never go camping again. I don't know why I agreed to this trip. Maybe it was the stress of work, or maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that I could still handle the outdoors like I used to. Either way, I found myself packing up my gear and heading deep into the woods alone, far away from any campground or other people. I wanted isolation. I wanted to disconnect. The drive took longer than expected. I had to take several turns onto smaller and smaller roads until the dirt path I was following barely looked like a road at all. Trees pressed in close on either side, and my tires kicked up dust as I moved forward. Finally, I found the small clearing I had marked on my map. It was perfect, secluded, quiet, and untouched. I set up my tent quickly. I had done this enough times before that it felt routine. The sun was still high, and I figured I had a few hours to kill before I needed to worry about a fire. I took a short hike, nothing too serious, just enough to get a feel for the area. The forest was thick, but beautiful. The air smelled like damp earth and pine, and the only sounds were the occasional chirp of a bird or the rustling of leaves when the wind picked up. By the time I got back to my site, the light had shifted into that golden hue of late afternoon. I gathered some firewood, taking my time to find the driest pieces I could. The last thing I wanted was to fight with damp logs when the sun went down. The fire started easily, the crackling sound comforting in the quiet woods. I made a simple meal, some canned soup heated over the fire, followed by a granola bar. Nothing fancy, but it was enough. As night fell, the forest changed. The sounds were different, more alive. Small creatures moved through the underbrush, unseen but definitely there. The fire cast long shadows against the trees, and beyond that, darkness swallowed everything. I wasn't scared. I had been camping alone before, but there was a certain unease that came with being truly alone in the woods. I sat by the fire for a while, watching the flames dance, listening to the distant hoot of an owl. When the air grew colder, I decided it was time to sleep. I double-checked that the fire was safe, then crawled into my tent. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, adjusted my pillow, and closed my eyes. I woke up to a sound. At first, I wasn't sure what it was. Just the wind, I told myself. But as I lay there, holding my breath, I heard it again. A snapping twig, A slow, deliberate movement outside my tent. I reached for my flashlight, careful not to make noise. My heart was pounding. I clicked it on and pointed it toward the tent wall. But of course, that didn't show me anything. Another sound, closer this time, heavy, not a small animal, something bigger. A bear? Maybe, but something about it felt wrong. I stayed still, listening. The movement was circling my tent, slow, almost methodical. My breathing was shallow, my ears straining. Then, just outside my tent, I heard it, a low, deliberate exhale. Something was there, right outside. I didn't move. My mind raced, trying to think of what to do. If it was a bear, I needed to stay calm. If it was something else, the zipper of my tent moved. Just a little, just enough to make my stomach drop. Couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My body refused to move. The zipper stopped. Silence. Then, a sudden violent shake of the tent. Not like the wind, not like an animal brushing against it. It was forceful, intentional. I shot up, flashlight in one hand, my knife in the other. I yelled, just a guttural, primal sound, hoping to scare whatever it was. The shaking stopped. Silence. I waited. Minutes passed. My heart wouldn't slow down. I listened, straining to hear anything outside. Nothing. I wasn't going to wait for it to come back. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could, stepping out into the night. The fire was just embers now, casting a faint glow. My truck was about 50 feet away. If I ran, I could make it. I took a slow step forward, scanning the tree line with my flashlight. Nothing moved. Another step, then another. Something shifted in the darkness. I didn't wait. I bolted for the truck, throwing myself inside and locking the doors. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the keys into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I slammed it into reverse, kicking up dirt as I sped back down the narrow path. I didn't stop driving until I hit the main road. Even then, I kept checking my mirrors, expecting to see something behind me. I didn't. I never found out what was out there that night. Maybe it was a person. Maybe just an animal acting strange. But something was wrong. I felt it in my bones. I haven't been camping alone since.